Well, good morning, Bob.
Good morning, Bill.
We are cruising along. It seems like a cold spring.
Just around here.
Well, some they've had snowstorms around the country. It's fairly unusual. So let's talk about economic storms and learning from the data, that sort of thing. There are all this data that we're seeing: big data, little data, trickling data, flood of data. Talk to us about first data, and then there's also a report in an article in the Washington Post talking about housing prices rising, that sort of thing. So talk to us about big data as we discuss where we go from here.
You know, it's very trendy right now to talk about big data.
Well, what is big data, by the way? What is it?
Well, the idea is that
Sounds
there's
like
so
somebody's name.
much data now that's being collected that you can sort of interpret what's going on just from the mass of data. You can use various statistical tools to sort of eke out some information that otherwise wasn't obvious.
So more than just describe what's happening, you can
Right.
use it to predict because there's so much.
Well, yeah, and you know, historically the idea was that you would create a model and then you would test the model and you'd have a little data to try and do that.
There'd be some error terms.
Error terms. You'd be able, you know. Now they're saying, okay, just give me the data and I'm going to run all sorts of analysis on that data. I'm going to figure out what's going on.
So if Harley Davidson looked at my life, would they predict that I would buy a Harley Davidson motorcycle or not?
Depends on if they looked at you personally or not.
And so if the answer to that was yes, what kind do you think I would buy?
I have no idea, Bill.
Probably a fat boy. But that's another discussion or another day. So let's talk about big data and some testing and really some error terms. And you've got a study that's been an oft-quoted study.
Well, over the past, you know, since we had the crash in the economy, there were two studies that a lot of policymakers in the U.S. depended on and quoted a lot, both here in the U.S. and in Europe. IMF, a lot of
Truth.
As truth, because these were academic studies.
It appeared in the American Economic Review.
Well, and they were, you know, I mean, they were by reputable economists. They were thought to be basically, you know, truth, as you mentioned. One was a study that was done by Reinhardt and Rogoff, both MIT professors. And basically it showed that if you look historically at the data, when the national debt was at 90% of GDP or greater, then the economy started really tanking. And so this was picked up by a lot of the state and federal legislatures that talk about how we needed to really pull back and control our debt. Well, more recently they've discovered that these results were driven primarily by a mistake in their Excel program.
That's not cool.
And secondly, by a number of assumptions that they made and weightings that they put on the data.
Well, now in a rebuttal in the Wall Street Journal, they said it was just the magnitude was always affected, not the results.
But that's not what the other people who looked at the data said.
I understand.
There have been about 10 other studies that looked at that and said, you guys were trying to get a result, and you manipulated the data to get that result. There's another one, but I can get the names wrong, Alesina and Ardagna, that you may have heard back in 2010, and it's also been recited many, many times.
What a great name for an economist, dogma.
Adagna.
Well, it sounds like dogma. All right, go ahead.
Anyway, that study said that if the government announces that they're going on an austerity program, they're going to cut government spending, it's going to build up so much confidence that the economy is going to boom. All right? And this was cited, I mean, this is the primary one that was cited for all of the cuts that were done in European.
Right.
Right. And it turns out that they didn't, when they did the analysis of their data, they didn't do any logical analysis. They just ran the statistics on the data. And so it turns out that when the economy is booming, your GDP goes up faster than the debt goes
Why,
up.
absolutely.
And so therefore the debt ratio goes down, and they were saying that was austerity. And when they actually looked at the times of actual policy austerity, they found that that result no longer held.
Well, and that's just, today we would call common sense.
You would think it's common sense, but that's been driving a lot of policy, and it's caused a lot of hardship across the world, you know, because of that policy.
So what are we to do about all this big data?
Well, you know, it's really a challenge. You may remember a few years ago there was the J.P. Morgan London whale problem, you know, caused by an Excel error,
right,
again, where instead of using the average of two numbers, they used the sum of the two numbers, and it caused a major change in the model, which caused a huge loss to J.P. Morgan. You know, it used to be that you had to run multiple tests and multiple different people doing the same thing, validating results to make sure that the result was correct. And anymore, that's not the case.
Now we just accept it as truth.
They take it as truth and they go with it, particularly if it already confirms what you think is true.
Exactly. Well, speaking of that, let's transition and talk about this Washington Post article about housing prices going up, where we believe that the markets are stabilizing, and yet we have some contradictory information. Unemployment remains historically high, and housing prices appear to be firming. In fact, in some markets there's shortages. Now, how do we reconcile those two? Is that investors?
Well, it appears to be investors. There's, you know, I mean, frankly, if you look out there, there's not a lot of options for your money. Okay, and
well,
there's a ton of money sitting on the
there
sideline.
is, and investors are trying to diversify out of stocks and bonds and into real estate. This is one direct way to do that.
Right. There's an interesting article in the New York Times this weekend by Schiller, where he talks historically about the booms and the busts that have occurred. A lot of times they were centered around land.
Right.
Okay, but around
vacant land, or as they say, they trade raw land.
Right, raw land, where you were going to create this big new development, and you'd advertise it, you'd
right,
sell that stuff, you'd chop that up and get the investors in there, make a whole new city, you know?
Exactly.
And but those were typically localized, and it wasn't until
in fact, the S&L crisis was on acquisition and development loans primarily,
exactly, right,
and not owner occupied. And see, what we have now returning to the markets is we have investors. It's still an owner-occupied, and so it appears as though we have shortages, but these houses are not being purchased for consumption by end users.
No,
They're purchased for the rental
right,
market.
The rental market. They're buying up these properties, they're renting them, they're anticipating that the housing prices are going to come back.
Right.
If they get back up to the historical trend,
they can earn a nice return just on the rental income,
right?
And then they've got the optionality on the upside.
Right, and we've had a number of those companies contact us and talk to us about data and stuff so that they can understand the prices. Big data. And, you know, because they're just going out and they're just buying hundreds and thousands of properties and then fixing them up a little bit, putting them out for rent, and figuring out that they'll sit through it and then sell it.
Well, banks are loving that because that's enabling them to clean up their balance sheets, all these properties that are delinquent and or have defaulted, and so they can clean all that up and get their balance sheets clean. That is occurring. So I think banks are getting their balance sheets clean.
Right.
And we're just not seeing the consumer come back in the market. That's driven by employment. We need that employment to come back.
We need the employment, and see that, you know, we're back to where we were before.
Right.
Some of the policy issues about cutting government expenditure were based upon the Reinhardt-Rogoff thing, which was an error, and therefore we have delayed the recovery in the U.S. when we could have, if we'd done what we should have done, put in the increased government spending, put in investment, we could have got the employment back up. Housing would be in great shape right now.
Now the speculation is the Fed is on hold until mid-2015. There's some articles out over the weekend speculating the Fed is on hold until mid-2015. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's likely, you know, because the economy, frankly, is very, very weak right now.
Especially housing.
Yeah, Schiller was, and one of the things he said, which was kind of a reverse for him, he says, now is probably a really good time for people to get into houses who are not looking as a speculative investment, but simply wanting to have a place to live.
Right.
Because interest rates are historically low and the prices have come down and maybe are around bottom now and starting to come back up. So he
So you're not catching a falling knife.
Right. And so he feels like it's a good time to get back in, but the problem is with the investors in there, there's no supply.
Right.
So, you have to take what you can get, I guess.
Well, speaking of taking what you can get, that's what we have to do this morning. So we're done for today. This is FNC Morning View. I'm Bill Rayburn with Bob Dorsey. You all have a fantastic week.